This is Cavanaugh's Corner, the labor talk show in southern Maine on public access television. This evening we'll be bringing you in its entirety a presentation at the Cleveland City Club Forum, an address given by the chief economist for Unite, Mark Levinson, on the global economic crisis, a labor point of view. We are able to bring this show to you tonight due to the kind efforts of the cable television station in Cleveland, which has kindly let us borrow their tape, and you'll be seeing the tape in its entirety. So with thanks to the Cleveland City Club Forum, to cable television station in Cleveland, and to Mark Levinson, let's join the Cleveland City Club Forum.
Major funding for the production of the City Club Forum is provided by Nordson Corporation, a world leader in systems that apply adhesives, sealants, and coatings during manufacturing operations to make today's products work better and last longer. Additional support is provided by the Nord Family Foundation.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the regular Friday Forum of the City Club of Cleveland. I am Dick Pogue, the president of the City Club, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Mark Levinson, who is chief economist for Unite, which is an acronym for the Union of Needletrades, Industrial, and Textile Employees, a union of about 300,000 members, which was formed in 1995 and is based in New York City. Mark Levinson grew up in Colorado, and he received his BA in economics from Colorado State University. He then earned both a master's and a PhD degree in economics at the New School for Social Research in New York. The New School really isn't new at all since it was founded in 1919, but it has an outstanding reputation in the educational field, particularly in economics and philosophy. It blossomed especially during World War II in that era, when a number of very outstanding scholars in Europe fled to the United States and relocated at the New School. After the completion of his formal education, Mark started his career as an economist with the United Auto Workers in Detroit. After 6 years in that role, he became, in 1990, chief economist for the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, which is an AFL-CIO organization. And then 2 years ago, he embarked upon his present position as chief economist and director of policy at Unite. His main area of interest is how the labor parts of our society are impacted by developments in the global economy in which the United States is so deeply involved. For example, he recently testified in Congress regarding a major bill which would eliminate quotas and tariffs on textiles which are imported into the United States from Africa. In the late 1980s, Mark visited Cleveland on a number of occasions and went to the old municipal stadium up on the lake, and he tells us that he actually loved that old stadium. So we've invited him to come back to Cleveland after August 21, 1999, because we think he'll be really infatuated with the new stadium, which will be on the same location. I'm very pleased to present Dr. Mark Levinson. His remarks today are entitled, "The World Economy in Turmoil, A Labor View." Dr. Levinson.
Thank you, Dick, for that kind introduction. In the United States today, we are in the midst of perhaps the end of an unprecedented economic expansion, touted by some as a result of globalization and our country's ability to function effectively in the world marketplace. Unemployment is down, inflation is down, corporate profits are at record levels, executive compensation is at record levels, and until a few weeks ago, the stock market was at record levels. But despite this good news, something else is occurring in the U.S. economy. Wages and family incomes have been stagnant for nearly 20 years, and we have the widest wealth gap of any industrialized country in the world. Now today, wages are starting to creep back up, but the cruel irony is that for middle-class Americans are not doing so well in the race for economic improvement. Largely because of the labor movement, we were able to raise the federal minimum wage, and because of that, families with lower incomes are finally getting some relief from wage stagnation. And at the other end, upper income families are doing quite well, thanks in part to the booming stock market, and thanks in part to the so-called middle-class tax cuts passed by Congress last year, the bulk of which went to people making more than $93,000 a year. But in the middle, where individual workers make between $23,000 and $55,000 a year, families aren't doing any better than they were in the late 1980s. In fact, the median wage today, over 7 years into an economic recovery, is lower, still lower than it was in 1989 at the peak of the last economic recovery. Unprecedented where so long into an economic recovery where the median wage has yet to recover the level it was at the previous peak. And in addition, families, working families, are under great pressure. There are more families in which both parents work. They face a situation where child care is scarce and costly. More people now go without health insurance, over 42 million at last count. 70 million are unable to afford adequate coverage. And fewer workers enjoy pensions. And now the basic principles of Social Security are under attack. And in this rich society, a staggering 1 in 4 children under the age of 5 is being raised in poverty. So even at the peak of a business cycle, the global marketplace doesn't seem to work very well for working people. And as events of the recent weeks show, it may be on the verge of getting a lot worse. I don't think we should fool ourselves that the recent sell-off in the world's stock markets simply reflect a nervous reaction to events in Russia or a long overdue correction. I believe they signify a gathering fear that the global economy is drifting towards a dangerous slump, driven by forces that world leaders only vaguely understand and are powerless to affect. Make no mistake about it, what is happening in the world economy is no longer an Asian crisis. Look around. Japan's recession is the worst since World War II. Latin America's economies are slowing. Russia's depression hurts its East European trading partners. China's economy is slowing. Africa, stagnant. And a slump in the U.S. would compound everyone's troubles. So the world economy seems poised on the brink of a worldwide recession. In fact, when I think of what's coming in the global economy, I'm reminded of the story of the famous British naval genius, Lord Nelson. Lord Nelson was with his men at sea. His lookout yelled, "Lord Nelson, 2 enemy ships on the port side." Lord Nelson turned to his assistant and said, "Sir, bring me my red pants." Bring him his red pants. They engaged the enemy ships, victorious, no problem. Next day, they're still at sea. The lookout yelled again, "Lord Nelson, 4 enemy ships on the starboard side." Lord Nelson turned to his assistant, said, "Sir, bring me my red pants." Bring him his red pants, and again engaged the enemy ships, and again, victorious, no problem. By this time, the aide was, he couldn't help but ask, he asked Lord Nelson, he said, "Sir, why is it every time before we go into battle, you ask for your red pants?" Lord Nelson patiently explained that in the unlikely event that he were to be injured, his men would not see his blood. They wouldn't panic. They would continue to fight. The aide was awed by this bit of tactical brilliance. The next day, the lookout yelled like he had never yelled before, "Lord Nelson, 20 enemy ships ahead, 20 in the rear, 20 on the port side, 20 on the starboard side." Lord Nelson, with a little trepidation in his voice, turned to his assistant and said, "Sir, bring me my brown pants." When I think of the global economy today, I sometimes think it is brown pants time. I want to do three things today. I want to make three points. First, I want to talk about U.S. trade policy and the global economy. U.S. policy towards the global economy and the problems with it, first. Secondly, to illustrate the problems I see in that approach, I want to talk about NAFTA and Fast Track, because I think they are a kind of microcosm of a much larger problem. Illustrates very nicely, I think, the problem of our approach to the global economy. And thirdly, say a few words about what I think needs to be done. So first, U.S. policy in the global economy. Two, illustrate the problems of that approach by looking at NAFTA and Fast Track, and we may be facing another vote on Fast Track soon. And third, a few words about what needs to be done. So first, U.S. trade policy and the global economy. For the last 2 decades, U.S. economic policy has been devoted to the creation of a global economy. Trade accords tore down barriers. Global agreements transformed laws on property and investment. Institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, the Export-Import Bank, the Overseas Private Investment Corporations provided subsidies and incentives to integrate countries into this process. And it was largely successful in one sense. So that we live and work in a global market is no longer a matter of dispute. The great engines of the U.S. economy, the industrial corporations, the banks, the service providers, are all global actors with loyalties and interests that extend far beyond the shores of this country. One result is clear. Jobs are on the move as never before. U.S. auto plants close, jobs go to Mexico. Garment jobs go to Central America. Data processing work is transferred to Ireland. Aerospace jobs go to China. Jobs are not just moving from industrial countries. Textile work is now leaving Thailand. Jobs are even leaving Bangladesh for cheaper labor in Vietnam and Cambodia. Workers everywhere grapple with what seems to be a race to the bottom. Reasonable wage demands anywhere are met with the threat or promise to seek cheaper labor elsewhere. Now, a core part of this global market is comprised of companies that play countries off against one another while seeking subcontractors with the lowest wages and cheapest conditions. For example, a recent report on U.S. companies in China by the National Labor Committee provides a devastating snapshot of this new economy. The following example comes from that report. Consider Avaline Company of Whippany, New Jersey, a lapel pin manufacturing firm that was named one of Entrepreneur Magazine's hottest new small businesses in America. When Avaline's president, Irwin Gordon, was asked by Business Week to explain his success, he did something very unusual. He told the truth. Let me quote. Quote, "We have a factory in China where we have 250 people. We own them. It's our factory. We pay them $40 a month, and they work 28 days a month. They work from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. with 2 breaks for lunch and dinner. They eat all together, 16 people to a room, stacked on 4 bunks to a corner. Generally, they're young girls that come from the hills." Unquote. Mr. Gordon has built one of America's hottest companies by keeping young girls in bondage and paying them 9 cents an hour to work 14-hour shifts, 7 days a week. The beneficiaries of this outrage are primarily the shareholders and executives of corporations like Dayton Hudson, J.C. Penney, Walmart, to name a few. In China, there's also a Korean-owned factory named Welco that employs 8,000 workers, most of them young women, making Nike shoes. Nike calls Welco a, quote, model contractor, and says its much publicized code of conduct has been distributed to all workers. When human rights advocates from the Hong Kong Industrial Committee and the Asian Monitor Resources Center met with workers last year, they found no one had heard of the code. The workers reported that Welco runs its production lines 11 and 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers can be fined for refusing overtime. 77 and 84-hour work weeks pay a base wage as low as 16 cents an hour, no overtime. Are these acceptable standards for a company that controls almost half of the U.S. sneaker market? A company that reported almost $800 million in profit last year from selling tennis shoes at over $100 a pair? A company whose founder and CEO is worth over $5 billion? Clearly, the global economy isn't working for workers in China and Indonesia and Burma any more than it is for workers here in the United States. And it seems to me we are now facing a turning point. That is, the issue is not, do we create a global economy? That's done. That debate's over. The issue is, how do we make the global economy work for working people? And the question that has to be addressed is, what are the rules in this new global economy? What are the rules? Which brings me to the second point, NAFTA Fast Track, which illustrates, I think, the problem in this new global economy. A year ago, President Clinton made Fast Track negotiating authority his top legislative priority, a little more than a year ago. The prospects for passage looked good. Let's go back in time. Every major newspaper supported Fast Track. Every major newspaper. The business community lobbied for it, and it outspent labor more than 2 to 1. The media was relentlessly pro-Fast Track. The president was at the peak of his popularity. This is before all the current stuff. He pledged to work with the Republican majority in Congress to pass the bill. And the president was more than willing to horse trade for congressional votes. One congressman who was offered several bridges for his district said, "All I need now is a few rivers." Everyone was for Fast Track except the people. And despite all of this, Fast Track was defeated. And it was a stunning defeat for the president. Most embarrassing for the president was the fact that more than 80% of Democrats in the House of Representatives opposed him. Never before in this century has the president's party in Congress, in the House of Representatives, rejected the president by such numbers. Never. Now, I believe to understand this, to understand what happened here, we have to go back a few years more to the early 1990s, when our society had a major debate, a several-year debate about NAFTA. And the supporters of NAFTA had an argument. I thought it was wrong, but they had an argument. They had a theory about how this trade agreement was supposed to work. And that theory, that argument, went something like this. We're going to create this massive North American market. It's going to be the largest market in the world. We're going to combine Canada, United States, Mexico into the largest market in the world. And they said it was going to be win, win, win. It's going to be good for Canada, it's going to be good for the United States, and it's going to be good for Mexico. How is that going to be? They said, yes, there will be increased investment in Mexico. And they said, yes, the United States would lose some jobs, and yes, Canada would probably lose some jobs. They said, but this increased investment in Mexico was going to result in increased wages in Mexico. Wages were going to go up in Mexico. NAFTA was supposed to create a middle class in Mexico. And so as wages went up, so the story went, they will buy more products from the U.S. and Canada. And that was going to create jobs in the U.S. and Canada. And in fact, the supporter said it's going to create more jobs in the U.S. and Canada than are lost due to increased investment going to Mexico. It's going to be win, win, win. And they made other claims. They said as the middle class is created in Mexico, the maquiladora factories on the border were going to decline because we were going to create a middle class in Mexico. They said that immigration to the United States would decline as the difference in living standards between the two countries narrowed. And they said the environmental disaster on the border would get better as a result of NAFTA. Now, what's interesting is that every one of these predictions, every single one, didn't happen. Not some of them, not most of them, none of them came true. Jobs were lost in the U.S. because of NAFTA. Wages declined in the U.S., not just because of NAFTA. There were other things going on, but NAFTA played a part. And in Mexico, Mexico suffered the most terrible economic crisis of all. Wages in Mexico are down 25 to 40%, depending on the sector, and they haven't recovered since. The maquiladoras have grown since NAFTA passed. There are now almost 1 million workers working on the border in the maquiladora factories, very low wages, where goods are produced for export into the United States. The environment on the border has deteriorated. It's gotten much worse. And people knew that. Now let me be clear about NAFTA, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about this. The problem with NAFTA is not that it was a trade agreement. There's nothing wrong with trade. Trade is good. And in fact, we're going to trade with Mexico whether NAFTA existed or not. But in fact, NAFTA had very little to do with trade per se. NAFTA is a trade and investment agreement. NAFTA is about setting the rules in this new global economy. NAFTA is several thousand pages long. If all it was about trade, it wouldn't have to be that long. But NAFTA is about detailed protections, specifying protections for U.S. corporations that invest in Mexico. So for example, before we signed NAFTA, we forced Mexico to change their laws protecting intellectual property to be like ours. What we didn't do was protect the rights of workers in Mexico. And so the problem with NAFTA is that it protects the rights of corporations. It protects corporations in moving investment, but it doesn't protect worker rights. You can read the 2,000 pages of NAFTA until you are blue in the face, and you won't find worker rights mentioned in the text. Now, there's a side agreement that is ineffectual, that is powerless, that doesn't have the teeth of the protections that exist for capital. And that is the problem, from my perspective, with NAFTA. And it is that as a kind of microcosm of what is wrong with U.S. policy towards the global economy. We protect the rights of the freedom of movement of capital. We don't protect the rights of workers to organize. Finally, let me say a few words. What is to be done? As I've tried to say, the issue is not one of free trade versus protectionism. I believe that debate is largely over. As I've said, the global economy is a reality. The issue now is, what are the rules in the global economy? The labor movement believes that trade accords must enforce labor rights and environmental standards, and that they are just as important as rules protecting investors or protecting capital. This should not be a new issue. We faced similar challenges before in this country. At the beginning of the century, the great corporations forged a national market and an industrial economy. And then, as now, the transition produced stark accumulations of wealth and power. It generated booms and busts. It displaced workers and farmers, and it sparked upheaval and protest. Progressives of that era sought to impose new rules on the economy to make it work for people. Food and drug standards, antitrust regulation, fair labor standards, a ban on child labor, and eventually labor rights, Social Security, consumer and environmental standards. These reforms did not come easily. They were not granted by the generosity of those who Roosevelt called the malefactors of great wealth. They met fierce resistance. They required worker organizing, citizen movements, a crusading press, leaders willing to challenge powerful interests. We now face the same challenge once again, but not at a national level, at a global level. Now, some economists, cloistered in their university towers, tell us that these transformations are inevitable. They say, don't worry, the global market will take care of these things by itself. It will inevitably lead to rising living standards, to democracy, and to better conditions. When I hear such sentiments, I am reminded of the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, when some suggested that the sit-ins and the demonstrations of his time were unnecessary, that time alone would solve our problems. Let me quote Dr. King. "Even a superficial look at history shows that social progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless effort and the persistent work of dedicated individuals. Without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the primitive forces of social stagnation." Unquote. Worker rights, I believe, is the great and urgent human rights struggle of our time. Our trade policy should promote those rights, not suppress them. I urge each of you to join in the persistent work that Dr. King talked about and that is so desperately needed today. Thank you very much.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we're listening to Dr. Mark Levinson, Chief Economist of Unite. Today's forum is the annual Sadie and Maurice Friedman Memorial Forum, which is made possible by a generous donation to the City Club Forum Foundation from Howard R. Berger and Robert M. Lustig in memory of their dear friends, the Friedmans. With us today at the head table is Robert Lustig, who was president of the City Club in 1986, and in his 12 years as past president has been a very dedicated member of the club. Bob, would you please stand for a moment and receive our warm welcome and thanks? Please make plans to join us next Friday, September 11, when the City Club of Cleveland will welcome Mr. Gregory Craig, Director of the Office of Policy Planning Staff for the United States State Department. Mr. Craig reports directly to Secretary Madeleine Albright, and it's his responsibility to ensure that U.S. foreign policy is cohesive and consistent across our country's many complex international relationships. Then a week later, on September 18, the City Club of Cleveland is very pleased to present William Ivey, the new chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts. This is a special breakfast forum on that day, September 18, which will begin at 8 a.m. And Mr. Ivey will be discussing the subject, the future of arts funding. At our regular Friday forum on that day at noon on Friday, September 18, the City Club will welcome Dr. Jean Betke Eshton, the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Professor of Political and Social Ethics at the University of Chicago, to our podium. Travel considerations for today's program have been provided by Continental Airlines, the official airline of the City Club of Cleveland. We'd like to thank Continental Airlines for working hard, flying right, and for bringing Dr. Levinson to Cleveland today. And as a director of Continental, I accept those thanks. Now it's time for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from anyone, including all guests who are in the room. Jim Foster holds the microphone in the front of the room, and Patty O'Brien holds the microphone in the back. First question, please.
Mr. Levinson, after what happened in the stock market the last couple of weeks, do you think there are still any supporters of the privatization of Social Security?
Unfortunately, I think the answer is yes. The campaign to privatize Social Security has enormous money and influence behind it, and I think they've been ahead of us. They've in making the case as to why privatization of Social Security is a good thing. I hope that the decline in the stock market kind of shocks people into awareness about what a dangerous step that would be. Let me just say that the labor movement is getting ready to mount a major campaign against the privatization of Social Security. And certainly the recent volatility in the stock market, should make people very wary about that.
Mr. Levinson, several months ago, when the African Free Trade Agreement was passed very narrowly in the House, Congressman Markey said that, words to the effect that if you thought NAFTA was bad, this is 10 times worse. On the other hand, most of the members of the Black Caucus in the House strongly supported the bill because they believed that this was a vital way to end the continent of Africa's dependence on U.S. foreign aid. Could you respond to those widely divergent viewpoints?
First of all, the Black Caucus was split on the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. Jesse Jackson Jr. Was one of the most outspoken opponents of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, and his, from my position, his perspective made a lot of sense. What he said was, I opposed NAFTA because it protected corporate rights and not worker rights. When we do the same thing for Africa, why should I support this when it has the same problems that NAFTA did? And he was right. The bill that passed in the House was completely silent on worker rights. There was nothing in that bill protecting worker rights, and there was actually more than is in NAFTA about corporate rights. That's why Representative Markey's comments. Now, just parenthetically, the bill that passed in the Senate is different, or it passed the Senate Finance Committee. It's going to come to a vote soon. It took out a lot of the problems on the House side. So what will happen to the African Growth and Opportunity Act is unclear at this point. Like I said, the bill that passed the Senate Finance Committee, from my perspective, is better than the one that passed in the House. But it's all mixed together in a large trade bill that includes Fast Track, that includes NAFTA parity for the Caribbean, includes a bunch of other things in the Senate. So what's going to happen to this piece of legislation is not clear. But I certainly support those who say the model that the Africa Trade Bill was modeled on is the wrong model for the very reason that I spoke about today. Oh, and by the way, just one other thing. Unions in Africa opposed this bill. Nelson Mandela opposed this bill. And so, you know, when the administration supporters were saying, you know, Africa supports this, well, some people in Africa support it and others don't.
Mr. Levinson, on the subject of trade and investment bills, could you speak on the multilateral agreement on investments? Is this still something that we should be concerned about? If not through the OECD, can we look for something like the MAI to be proposed through another body? And if so, how can we organize against this?
Yeah, the multilateral agreement on investment is something that's being negotiated at the OECD by the world's leading industrial countries. Essentially what it does, it's an attempt to really set rules on investment worldwide. You know, some opponents have characterized it as NAFTA on steroids. It's a kind of worldwide rights for capital, the freedom of movement of capital. For several years, these negotiations were going on virtually in private and secret. No one knew anything about it. It's you know, starting to get more publicity now. In light of what's happening now in the world economy, in light of what happened in Asia, and in light of what's happening now in, you know, Latin America and elsewhere, there's a lot of questions being raised about, you know, is this the way to go? Is the problem with the global economy that capital, you know, doesn't have the freedom to, you know, move in and out of countries easily enough? I don't think that's the problem in today's world economy. However, it is being negotiated at the OECD. Those negotiations continue. There's talk that if it doesn't succeed there, that it will be taken up at the WTO. It's a little hard to say where that's going now. My prediction is that the more this becomes known, the more opposition there will be to it. It's just starting to become known now in the United States. And I would say, you know, it's very important to get the word out about MAI and to inform ourselves and our communities about what it means, and to start putting pressure on politicians to start raising questions about this.
Could you just give us briefly the sort of a short outline of the kind of items that you would include in a NAFTA type bill that would protect worker rights, and then how that would impact the relationship among the parties who are signatories to the...
Yeah, that's a good point. What we want in trade agreements like NAFTA, we want what are referred to as internationally recognized labor rights. The right to free association, the right to free speech, abolition of child labor, and so on, that these rights should be embedded in the core of the agreement, not shuttled off to side agreements, in the core of the agreement, subject to the same sanctions and dispute settlement mechanisms as exist now for investors or for capital rights. For example, if one violates intellectual property rights now in Mexico under the provisions of NAFTA, it's a crime. You can go to jail. If one violates labor rights, there are no such sanctions. There are no such penalties. And what we want is to see labor rights elevated to the same status, subject to the same penalties, sanctions, dispute settlement mechanisms as the rights of capital. And we've said, the labor movement, let it be known to the administration before the fast track fight that if fast track, if the president's proposal on fast track included labor rights and environmental standards in the core of the agreement, we would support it. That wasn't done.
Mr. Levinson, during the past year, we have seen some very serious economic, financial disasters in Japan, in the other parts of the Far East, and even in some nations closer to us in Central America and South America. As an economist, I'd be very interested in what suggestions you might have as to how the United States can avoid a similar economic or financial problem.
Well, that's a big question. I mean, right now, you know, there are so many problems in the. Let me start by saying what I think the United States should have done in response to the crisis in Asia, which, in a sense, we are still living with now, because it's almost, you know, it was 1 year ago, July, when Thailand devalued, that started the so-called crisis in Asia, which is now becoming a crisis in the world economy. But what was done in Asia by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, I believe, and many others believe, made the problem worse. That as a condition for the IMF loans, essentially austerity was imposed in all of these countries, which made the problem worse. By the way, you contrast that with what happened in the United States after the 1987 stock market crash. What happened here? Stock market crashed, and the way we prevented disaster was the markets were flooded with liquidity. Alan Greenspan did the right thing, and the U.S. Treasury, when it applied to us. If we would have imposed austerity in the United States right after the stock market crash, I think we might have seen here what is now happening in Asia. And in Asia, it's a very interesting situation. You look at the last year. For the last year, things have been getting worse and worse and worse, in contradiction to all the predictions. In other words, every quarter's results since the crisis started are worse than the previous quarter's prediction. They first said, well, there will be you know, these economies are going to go through a difficult period, they're going to slow down, but you know, these policies that the IMF is imposing, really dictated by U.S. Treasury, you know, will provide the groundwork for a solid recovery. And they've been saying that since the crisis hit, and meanwhile it gets worse, and it gets worse, and it gets worse. It's an increasing number of voices are saying part of the problem, not the only problem, but something that made a bad situation worse was the conditions imposed by the IMF. And the U.S. has a lot to do with those conditions. And so what is needed now in the global economy, desperately, is increased demand. We need to wages need to be raised in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, in the United States. There is massive overcapacity in the world economy. And as long as there is this massive overcapacity, there is going to be, I believe, the possibility of a serious downturn. And the way I believe we should respond to this overcapacity is to increase demand, either, you know, through government or through raising wages, which, by the way, comes back to the point I've been talking about, the importance of worker rights. Workers, I'm not talking about imposing U.S. standards around the world. I'm just saying workers should have the right to organize to raise their own standard of living in ways that are appropriate for the societies that they live in. For example, and just to, again, to get back to this point about the IMF and Asia, we, in the American labor movement, found it kind of particularly galling that the IMF imposes all these conditions about how these countries have to structure their financial system, about what the price of oil should be, this, that, and the other thing. Meanwhile, leading trade unionists are in jail, no worker rights in these countries. Why aren't the one of the conditions for an IMF loan, why shouldn't it be that in order to receive this money, the countries have to recognize internationally recognized worker rights? I mean, that was one of our demands on the IMF that didn't get too far. But I don't know if that was an answer to your question. Perhaps it wasn't, but.
Dr. Levinson, for a long time, the union, especially the garment workers union, wanted to every American buy only American-made goods. I have lately heard that the Mariana Islands, who are not only far away, but also the people in the Mariana Islands are citizens, American citizens, where they have no wage, no minimum wage, where there are Chinese companies manufacturing textiles and ready-made goods that are then sold in the United States at cheap prices with a label made in the United States. What is your union doing in regards to that situation?
Yeah, what you say is true. There are terrible labor conditions in the Northern Marianas Islands. Garments that are produced there are sold in the U.S. with a made in the USA label. We've testified about this situation, before Congress, arguing that U.S. if there's a made in the USA label there, the same laws that apply in the U.S. should apply there. We haven't been successful in that fight, but it's a terrible situation there. People are exploited very badly, and we're trying to bring this to to people's attention and saying you can't kind of have it both ways.
Dr. Levinson, U.S. Labor Department today again announced a 4.5% unemployment rate, and there's still a lack of skilled workers in the United States. Given the arguments that you posed today, how would you answer that?
I would question whether there's really a lack of skilled workers in the United States. It's very good. I'm very glad that unemployment has come down as much as it has. But one thing that's interesting, economists for years said, well, you can't get unemployment below 6%, because if unemployment gets below 6%, labor markets are going to be too tight, wages are going to start going up, that's going to lead to ruinous inflation. One reason that theory has been proved wrong, one reason is there's a lot more slack, I believe, in our labor markets than the official figures indicate. And one thing that's been happening in this recovery is that as more and more jobs become available, people who were previously not captured by the official statistics as in the labor force enter the labor force. And that is one reason why we haven't had kind of inflationary pressures which economists predicted. And economists said that you can't do what we're doing now. So the problem in our labor markets, I believe, is not that we lack skilled labor. It's that workers lack power, and that jobs are going up, and yes, wages are starting to come up at the bottom, but wages are still badly lagging productivity. Since the early 70s, and the reason I believe is that workers lack power, that there's nothing automatically that translates increased productivity into increased wages, that the labor market needs institutions to ensure that workers get their fair share. So my academic friends called wage-setting institutions. I have a simpler name for it. It's called unions. Unions have declined in this country to a dangerous level. I mean, I think we're on the way back up now. There was nowhere to go but up. We hit rock bottom. But the crisis in American pay, I think, the answer to that is in part stronger employment and in part stronger unions. It's not really a skill problem.
Dr. Levinson, I followed the NAFTA debate in part as someone with environmental concerns, but I must admit I was puzzled by the environmental community's position, as I was somewhat puzzled by the labor community's position, because it seemed to me that what I heard was a request that before we adjust our trade relations, actual substantive laws governing another country would need to be created, put into effect. On child labor laws, a very complicated piece of legislation. And it began to sound to me like what was being set up was a sort of wish list of things which might be wonderful to happen, but they involve so much actual legislation in another country that it was almost inconceivable that would happen in the context of a trade negotiation. I have wondered why that you being those people opposed to NAFTA, haven't picked out one piece of right-giving law that you would say, that's what we want to have in, so that the people in those countries then can organize themselves better, can legislate for themselves more effectively, so we have another country to deal with that is running its own affairs well, rather than trying to say the precondition of trade legislation will be a bunch of new laws in that other country.
Well, recognize that that's precisely what we did with the rights for investors. We would not sign NAFTA until Mexico changed their law on protecting intellectual property rights. Not made a commitment, not said that, yeah, we'll do the right, changed their law. That's what international agreements do. International agreements bind the parties to that agreement to certain rules, standards, codes of behavior. I believe the problem with that is not that there are these international agreements. I think that's largely inevitable. The problem is the rules are skewed. They benefit some interests to the detriment of others. And we're arguing for an equality on the rules. Now, we have attempted to specify, concretely what it is we would like to see. And like I said, we're not attempting to impose U.S. minimum wage on Mexico. That's not realistic. That's not what we're arguing for. And when people who say that, they often say it and they know better. That's not what the demand is. The demand is that basic rights be recognized. That when workers in Mexico attempt to form a union, that they're not doing so under the threat of death. And so that, as long as the rules of the world economy are going to be shaped in these, and by the way, even calling it a trade agreement is I think is a misnomer. As I said, it's much more a trade and investment agreement. Really setting the rules for how a global economy functions. The rules have to protect, worker rights as well as it does investor rights. That's the demand.
Mr. Levinson, do you agree with me that Tuesday's rebound in the stock market, to get down to some of the, if I may say, brass knuckles of international economy, were largely attributable to President Clinton's address to the young leaders of Russia, and what else might you have suggested?
I claim no knowledge, understanding of the stock market, first of all. And so, I think what, as, who was it that said, the stock market has predicted 9 out of the last 5 recessions. The relationship between the stock market and the real economy now is, I would say tenuous at best. Although having said that, I believe, I can't prove it, but I believe that the stock market has gone up so high that a stock market collapse here, could very well contribute to an economic downturn in this country. But what caused the 500-point decline and what caused the 300-point rebound? I really claim ignorance.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we have been listening to Dr. Mark Levinson, Chief Economist for UNITE, the Union of Needletrades, Industrial, and Textile Employees. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.